Good morning. If you can't tell, there's a little bit different service today, so let me start things up. Ancient Near East, there's this nomadic tribal people in the middle of the wilderness, and the reason why they're there after 40 years, they're still there, is because they are called to be children of God, but they've rebelled against their father. And so finally that time of rebellion, that time of discipline is coming to an end, and they're entering into the promised land. The ancient Israelites are going to enter into the promised land. And Moses, who is to lead the people, he stops and he preaches one last sermon. We call that the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy means second law. It's a repeating of the law of God. This is how you're supposed to live as children of God when you enter into the land. This is what you're called to. This is what you're invited into as God's family. And he famously gives us kind of the heart of his message in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Listen to these words. These are the commands, decrees, and laws that the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as they live, by keeping his decrees and commands that I give you, so that you may enjoy a long life. Like, this is what God's inviting you into. And then verse 4, probably the most famous verse in all of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. But then it goes on. These commandments that I give to you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands. Bind them on your forehead. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates, that it should, everything you do, everything you talk about, everything you think about, every place you enter into should lead into these conversations about the God who has invited us into relationship and to loving him. In the same breath that we are told to love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, we are told, now impress this upon your children. And that sounds really great. That makes great sense until you have kids. So my introduction to having children was rather abrupt. When my daughter, our firstborn, came out, she came out and she didn't cry. I knew enough as a father that's not normal. Her airway was blocked. And so these nurses scramble and doctors, and they clear her airway. And they tell her, it's all right. Just some amniotic fluid was blocking her air path. But I'm like shaking and, already frightened as a father. And then later that night at her 2 a.m. feeding, she woke up fed, and then she coughed and stopped breathing. And Jenny and I freak out. We were losing our minds. And then we punch the button, screaming, telling the nurses to come in. They come and clear her airway. And I remember the first moments of being a father, right? Holding my little girl that night and feeling such an indescribable love, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. The love of a father or a mother for their child, coupled with a sense of helplessness unlike I've ever felt before. And that's my 13 years experience of parenting wrapped up in a moment. Indescribable love, unbelievable helplessness. And that's what we want to talk about today, specifically we're pausing the book of Daniel, but we're not really pausing it. We're applying the book of Daniel, what we talked about last week. The question we came up with last week was, how do we raise kids in Babylon? If you remember, Daniel and his friends were ripped out, just as teenagers, ripped out of their home in Judah, ripped out of their faith, ripped out of their families, everything plopped into this Babylonian university, this 3-year program in which they were reprogrammed into the ways of Babylon. They were their identity, their beliefs, their family, everything about them was deconstructed, and then they're trying to remake them into this Babylonian way. And we said last week, and I think that Babylonian system of reprogramming still exists. It's not called Babylon anymore, but that program, that system of a culture that tries to conform you to the ways of this world still exists today. And the question I want to talk about today specifically is how do we live in this? How do we manage this? Our kids, specifically, there's lots we could go into. I want to point out, this is not a new conversation. If you read the book of Judges, you know that parents have always struggled with, how do we raise our kids in the way of the Lord? This goes back to ancient times. But there is something new with technology, globalization, iPhones, unsleeping AI systems that are trying to capture your attention, sell it off to the highest bidder. So back in the olden days, if Babylon wanted to remake you in the way of Babylon and deconstruct your faith and give you a new Babylonian identity, they had to send you off to a 3-year program. Today, there's an app for that. So the question we're going to ask specifically with this panel is, how do we raise kids in Babylon, or more explicitly, how do we raise kids who know and love Jesus in a world that systematically works to deconstruct their identity, undermine their faith, and endlessly distract them? Now, I've asked these 4 parents, who we'll introduce in just a second, for a variety of reasons. One, because I respect each of them, and each of them has a different story, a different angle. I specifically love the fact that we have public school, private school, and homeschool all represented on this. 2 things before we jump into our panel that I just want to set up as guardrails to this conversation. And the first is this, is that unfortunately, our kids have a will of their own. So what I mean by that is some parents will raise their kids in church. They will give them good biblical names like Jeconiah and Abishag, and they will have family devotions every night. They'll do everything, and their kids will rebel and turn away from the Lord and never follow Jesus. And then many of you grew up in homes where Jesus was never known, never spoken, never loved. Homes of rebellion, homes of feuding and brokenness and hatred, and grew up to love Jesus. So those things, we're not saying like parenting, any pride that you have of like, I created that. No, you didn't. Right? Pride has to die. The other thing that has to die, though, is shame. Shame is really unhelpful. There's something about this conversation that is particularly powerful for opening up areas of shame, hurt, past struggles, both with your own parents and with how you've parented or how you are parenting. All of those things come open here. And I just specifically want to invite you to, if you're feeling those feelings, maybe that's something you have to address. It really is. And I don't want you to cover that up or hide that. I do think maybe that's a place you need to go with the Lord, maybe with a counselor in the Lord. Today, for today's purposes, though, I want to declare this to be a grace-filled conversation. Meaning grace is by grace through faith. Grace being, it's not about you. God's love and acceptance and his pleasuring you is not based on what you did. It's a free gift by faith, not on what you've done or not done or what's been done to you, but based on what Jesus Christ did. So, with that being said, that being our platform for today, I want to take the rest of the time to ask these panel of experts about their experiences. So let's do introductions, and you guys, I'll just hand it off to you.
My name is Wendydericko. I'm married to Bob for 34 years, and we have 6 daughters, 5 biological and 1 who came to us when she was 20. They're anywhere from age 32 to 19 right now. And I am a teacher at Conestoga High School, and Bob and I work with the 20s group here at GVF. And I'll just say that I definitely needed to hear Paul's little message about grace, because I feel like I constantly need that as a parent. I'm constantly second guessing and regretting decisions, and so it's a good message.
My name's Tom Walsh, and I guess I'm here to give you the long perspective, because I've been married to that girl back there for 51 years. My daughters are in their 40s. We even got some grandkids. A couple of them are even here. I'm not sure. They kind of scare me that my grandsons are here. So my perspective is get the big haul, which hopefully will induce a little bit of hope in you, because I guess I'll go into more detail later, but our precious 3 daughters put us through the meat grinder big time, and just taught me so much through that, and taught me a whole lot about God. So maybe I can share a little bit about that as we get into our conversation.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Marianne Stutzman. I have been married to Nate for 15 years. We have 3 kiddos. Noah is 12, Malia is 10, and Leland is 7. And I am up here on a panel of parenting giants. But I think God has taught us a lot in the last 12 years. And I'm excited to share some of that with you guys. I help run the GVF Family Discipleship Program here. I help take care of my family of origin in New Jersey, and I homeschool our kids. So part of our big philosophy, so to speak, and kind of heart of parenting is to parent our kids as God parents us. So that doesn't mean having satisfied, happy kids 24/7. It means having kids who will be godly adults. So starting at a really young age of figuring out what does it mean to raise kids, not to just be good kids, but to be kids who come to know and love Christ all the days of their life.
My name is Varun Matthew. I've been married to Miriam for 27 years now. We are both originally from India. We have 3 children. Talia is 20, third year junior in college. Nathaniel is 17 and a high school senior, and Sanaya is 15 and a 10th grader. We had 4 miscarriages before Talia and 1 after. I mentioned that to say that has a big impact on how we see. I wouldn't be here if not for God's redeeming grace in our lives in that sense. So we encourage our children strongly not to sin, but we tell them, and when you do, we worship a God who loves to redeem. So make sure you remember that as much as I need to all the time.
Thanks. So I want to start out with kind of a high-level question, and this is slightly different than what you guys have heard. So I got to throw some curveballs. So in terms of protecting and preparing, clearly when your kids are little, protecting is everything. You have to protect them. But the goal is that long-term, you don't want to throw them to the wolves, but you have to prepare them increasingly so that when they live on their own, they are fully prepared adults to navigate complexities and struggles and temptations and all the things that they're going to face. How have you, any principles you would give that have set, like, here's key moments in their life or key practices we've done to help balance between when to protect and when to lean into preparing them and pushing them out?
This may sound too general, but in analyzing my own journey, what has kept me from getting pulled left or right? I came to Christ at 22, raised up, didn't really care much about religion up till then, and God just radically changed my life. And basically the core is I met this Jesus, and I still can't get over him. I'm just captured by him. And I've been ministering. I've been in the ministry for 52 or 53 years. And I'm still just absolutely captured by him. So I believe the best thing I can do is expose my kids to the works and the words of this Jesus and let him woo them to himself. So that would be my word. Expose them, and then I'll use another word, include them, involve them in the life. And so I could expound on that a little bit more, but exposure and involvement.
I think that we have to really focus on the fact that kids are never too young to come to know Christ or to have a relationship with him. And it's something that we can't assume, when they're 10 or 12, we'll really focus in on their faith. And, my oldest is 12 and a half. So for us, this has been our greenhouse years, so to speak, where we are nurturing and teaching them how to read scripture, teaching them how to hear the Holy Spirit, teaching them how to pray, teaching them how to have a personal relationship with Christ. And at some point, plants leave the greenhouse. They need storms, and they need to grow roots, and they need trials, and they need things to grow deeper with Christ. But at these earlier stages, I think sometimes we as parents think, well, they just need their diaper changed and food. But in the womb is the time to start praying over your kids, or before you have them, and your friends' kids, and all the kids in your family. So starting really early and really young, helping to introduce them to who Christ is important.
I'll just throw in, going from protection to preparing. Basically, when they're little, it's like, this is who you can play with, this is what you're allowed to do. We're more or less just telling them. And then I think as they grow up, it becomes gradually more of a conversation. Well, is this a good group for you to be hanging out with, and engage them in that conversation so that they're starting to learn to make decisions on their own while you gradually let go of the reins a little bit.
So taking this question one step further to be more specific. As I sent out an email asking for questions from the congregation, one of the themes that came through, no surprise, is technology. Deeply impacts all of our children and impacts us in ways that we're just grappling with. And, the dangers of that, but also knowing that we have to, on the one hand, you do want to protect them. On the other hand, you have to prepare them for adulthood to handle it on their own. And just wanted to see if you guys would speak into that. And I do want to start with Naveen, because Naveen, specifically learning from him, was some of the practices that brought into our family that our kids very much loathe and we very much celebrate.
I would like to say the heart of technology is the technology of the heart. So you can put certain principles into practice, but if it doesn't reach the heart, it's of no use. So at an early age, we decided in our family that the kids will have no technology access through the week. So it begins on Friday evenings and ends on Sunday nights. Miriam and I ourselves, we didn't watch too much TV at that time. We had our laptops. But nevertheless, it was very clear that they will not have access to it. And that was, I lay the rules as a disciplinarian in the family. There was no going back on that. So the kids naturally love to watch TV, and also they would come running back from school on Fridays and watch TV, and that's perfectly fine. They had to do their homework as well over the course of the weekend. And when they became teenagers, we got them phones. But there again, we made sure that when they came for family prayer in the night, they brought their phones with us and gave it to us, and it would be by my bedside. And that's how it was. Now, of course, we don't do that. My youngest is 15. In fact, when Nathaniel, my 17-year-old, got a phone as well as his laptop, he brought both of them without my intimation or anything. He brought them to me and he said, "Appa, will you please put your password in here so that he cannot use it. He cannot, even if he is tempted, that he will not be able to go onto many sites that he shouldn't." And there are many occasions, even now, almost every other day, he comes to me and says, "Please put your password in because I'm trying to search for something and it's not coming up." So I put my password in, he searches, and then within about 10 minutes, he brings it back to me and says, "Okay, go ahead and put the password back on." So I mentioned that to say he himself has bought in to the fact that he is vulnerable at his age to certain things, and therefore he needs to have me as a security.
Wendy, do you have anything to add? Because I know.
Yeah, this is where a lot of my parenting guilt comes, because I don't necessarily think we did the greatest job with phones, but it gives me a chance to encourage, especially you younger parents whose kids maybe don't have phones yet, that first of all, I would put it off as long as you can. But then the second thing is, from the beginning, establish that you have the ability to see their phones. Every family plan that your service makes available to you that kind of gives you parental controls, I would put that on. There's just so much danger out there, whether it's pornography or bullying, shaming, just addiction to the phone, just little games that they get addicted to and waste time instead of studying and stuff. But there's just so much that I feel like as a parent you want to establish from the beginning, and then you don't have to try to come in when they're 17 or 18 and say, "Oh, by the way, we want to do that." Just start from the beginning. We're the parents, and we get to kind of say what you can and do. Oh, one other thing. So Bob and I were talking yesterday, like when our older girls wanted to go to a movie, we'd kind of go online or something and try to find out what was good or bad in the movie so we could make a decision. Well, now those movies are in their hand. And so again, just a reason to be really aware of how they're using their phones.
So another question that came up from the emails one I haven't asked yet, is balancing, the question that came up is basically the busyness. There's so much for our kids, so much good stuff for our kids to be involved with, but it's creating this like sense that they have to do everything, fear of missing out, all of that. How have you guys tried to navigate that as parents? It's a new question, so.
We just don't do as much as everyone else. So I think sometimes these conversations are just that you're going to look different than the rest of the world. And that's okay, right? Daniel did, and sometimes we have to make those calls for our kids. Ideally, so all three of them could be in 3 different events every night of the week, and we could be running around like crazy. But we make decisions based on their interest and skill sets, based on our budget, our financial budget and our time budget, based on our marriage. Are all of these events helping or hindering our marriage? Are they helping or hindering our relationships with our kids? I just think while they're in our homes, we are their primary influence in teaching them to know and love God. So we pray about it. We really do. We spend a lot of time praying about it, and we're okay that our kids play soccer 8 weeks out of the year and not 52. And they're not as good as everyone else on their team, and that's okay. That's a sacrifice we're willing to make.
So we are kind of unique in that my little girls, they were 5, 3, and 1, and we packed them up and we moved them over to France. And so they grew up in a context totally secular, totally atheistic, and that's where they grew up and that's where they went to school. So when I say exposure, they need exposure to other things, and the exposure that they had, just because of what we were doing, is getting involved in the activities that we were involved in. So, which was, we're trying to plant a church, and church started in our home, and so they were involved in that. Even though there were a lot of other things they could have been doing, they didn't have a choice about some of the things because they just kind of hung around with us and gave them exposure to and an awareness of and observation of God at work. So they saw people come to Christ, they saw people getting baptized, they saw us in our homes having kids over and doing little things to introduce their friends to this hope that is in this person, Jesus. So we didn't have all those things pulling at them as far as other activities. They were involved in gymnastics and things like that, but there wasn't the pull like there is here to get them involved in every level of sports you can and then take them, to become future NFL players or whatever. So I think we were fortunate in that what we were doing had a built-in input into their lives.
Do you want to say a quick word?
Yeah, we've probably way overdone it on busyness. The one thing I would say is that if you're going to do, whether it be soccer or dance or whatever it is, use that as an opportunity to teach your kids that is an area of ministry too. Like, it's not like we do that and it has nothing to do with our relationship with God. If we're going to be involved in these people on a team, then these people are the people that God has put into our circle to minister to.
Mm-hmm. He give an example of how you guys have done that in a pretty extraordinary way. So
we, Bob has coached all of our girls in soccer many, many years, and so we would try to leverage those relationships, and we had Bible studies with the parents, and we'd have like kids club where we'd invite all the soccer players and other people to come to our house, and it was amazing how many parents just let them come, whether they worked from a spiritual background or not. And so we really just tried to bring people into our home and engage them in spiritual conversations as much as we can.
Yeah, and this brings us to kind of the big question of engaging the culture and engaging the world, and getting your kids involved in that, and also protecting your kids and thinking through that. Specifically, I'd like to talk about schooling, because that's a big issue, obviously, today. Personally, I grew up going to public school and went for a brief period in college to a Christian school. Absolutely hated it. Withered. Went to a state university. My faith flourished. But my kids, they went to public school, then we homeschooled, and now we're at a Christian school. So I've kind of seen the gamut, and I know that different people flourish in different ways. I'd love for this panel in particular, we've got public school, homeschool, and private school all on this panel, and I'd love to hear you guys speak into that, and whoever wants to jump in first.
Okay. I believe it's the Southern writer Walker Percy who said you can get all A's and still flunk life. Clayton Christensen was a Harvard Business School professor and considered the greatest management guru for many years in running. He was a Mormon. And at the end of his class at HBS every year, he would address his students. And he would say, he was a student himself at HBS. And he said, we have our reunions. And at the fifth reunion that I had, all of us would come back. And, we went to HBS, so most of them were working at McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, all the most prestigious firms, and working in the most exotic locales and making boatloads of money. And everyone comes, they're married people who are much better looking than them. And then comes the 10-year reunion. In that, you don't have as many people who come. They're still making fabulous amounts of money, but some have had divorces now. There are a few who are living on either coast. They are living on one coast, and their family and their children are on another coast. They haven't seen each other for years. And then you have the 20th, 25th, and 30th year reunions. And you have way fewer people. Now, they're doing very well, but some. And he said Jeffrey Skilling, who was one of the youngest partners at McKinsey, went on to become the CEO of Enron, was in prison. And another friend of his, classmate of his, was having his political campaign fabulously, doing really well, and had, despite being married and having children, having an affair with a teenage girl, went to prison. And he writes in this relatively unknown book, How Will You Measure Your Life? He says, we fail in teaching our kids, our students, how to live and be personally successful while they are professionally fabulously successful. I mention that to say that education, as it was always understood for the last 2,500 years, since Plato first mentioned classical Christian education, which is what my children attend, said that education, the word itself comes from the root educe, which means to lead out of ignorance of matters of the mind and morals. So if we are sending our children to a school which educates them, leads them out of ignorance of only the mind, it's not doing its job. And that's why in my extreme bias, I am dead against public schools because they don't give an absolute standard of truth and right and wrong and good and evil in God. So unless you are giving them an education in the morals as well, you will send them to be fabulously professionally successful, and they may even go to HBS and Stanford and Wharton, and then potentially live, unfortunately, unsuccessful lives. So a classical Christian education is one where it follows the growth of a child. The first stage, quickly, is the grammar stage, which just says data. Kids at a very young age are growing up and just absorbing information. The periodic table in chemistry, which has about 125, 130 elements. Sanaya in third grade, she's in 10th grade now. Third grade, she learned within half an hour or 45 minutes, all 125 of them. If I put her on the stand now, she'll probably remember 25 or 30 of those. So that's how children just bring it in. The second stage, between 6th and 7th grade or so, is the logic stage where they grow, and now they're asking why. All this data that you've given me, why the why of that. And so that's the logic stage. And the last is around the 9th and 10th grade. The classical Christian education focuses on the rhetoric where, okay, I now have all the information and understand the why, but how can I persuasively explain my thoughts on this subject to the next person? So it follows the child's growth. And that's why I think if you are not sending your children to a classical Christian education, you are sinning.
Tell us how you really feel, Naveen. No.
So that's
yeah,
not
yeah.
an option for all of us, right? I would love that. I have 3 children, and I'm a social worker. So financially, that does not work for my family, and it might not work for yours, right? I think it's awesome that you're doing it. I mean, good push there. But exactly what you're saying about the stages of learning, and I think we can turn that into discipling our kids at home. So I homeschool. I love it. Everyone should homeschool. That's my push. If you want to be more like Jesus, you should homeschool your kids. Trust me. It's called sanctification. Anyway, they were in the first service and could attest to all of these things. Nonetheless, what you're saying, so if that's not an option for you and you are trying to train your kids well at home while they might be in public school or a different school setting, part of it was knowledge. You said teaching your kids the Bible and scripture at a young age, then why does it matter? Why does it make sense as they get older, and then being able to evangelize as they continue growing out of that, making that faith their own? So the same that you can use for logic and education, you can use for our faith, for our kids. So you should homeschool, but I'm not going to hold you to it.
I'd like Wendy to speak into this.
Okay, so I said in the first service, if I had heard Naveen's little speech before we made our decision, it might have been different. We made this decision 27 years ago, actually, which was a very different time than now. I will say that to preface it. And there were a couple of things that fed into our decision. First of all, I had been teaching in the district where we live. We were working with the youth group and focusing on kids in that district. And we knew there were a lot of believers throughout the district, which fortunately there still are. And I would just say for you guys that have kids in public school, just pray that God continues to raise Christian teachers to be influences. And then the biggest thing then for us was we, at that point in our lives, that was kind of our vision that we felt like God had given us as a mission, was to have a spiritual influence in this particular school district. And so as soon as our kids got into the school, we volunteered for every possible thing we could. We got to know the teachers, the other parents, and just tried to basically allow God to use us. I will say again, this is a different time, and if we were making the decision now for certain of our kids, I'm not sure we would make that same decision. Some, I think, still totally thrived in the public school and were able, they had convictions that they were able to stand for. Others may have been better off in a different situation, especially in this time.
So, changing hard turn here, and I want to start with Tom. Doubts, rebellion, and unhealthy relationships. If you parent long enough, your kids are going to struggle with all of those. How do you walk alongside your children? Any words of advice, any practical wisdom for thinking through those times?
Short answer would be no. But here's our experience. So our girls grew up in France, totally secular culture. And then as teenagers, they got uprooted and parachuted into the main line. Teeny bopper culture, fast-paced, affluent, and totally lost orientation and had some really hard things happen to them. They were lonely, they were hurting, and so a lot of anger and just acting out took place. So how do you face that? Well, both Marcia and I were disoriented. Mom and Dad were disoriented as well. Mom and Dad were hurting. And so we just kind of were living day by day and trying to address this unknown thing that we had, because our oldest was 16 when we moved back, and our first years were really cool, a lot of fun. But we got back here, it turned into hell, and we were unfamiliar with that. So So it wasn't like there was one doubt here, one doubt there, one issue here. It was all happening at the same time. So that's why I said my first answer was no, because we were disoriented and didn't quite know what to do. We did our best. We tried to stay engaged. The counsel I ended up giving somebody was the most important thing you can do when your kids are in crisis is protect your marriage, because that's going to do a number on your marriage. It could. Because you love these kids more than you love anything else in life, and you're not totally sure your spouse is doing it quite right and maybe making it worse. And so that would be my advice. Protect your marriage, pray like crazy. And then in one sense, the way I've framed parenting, it's God's classroom for us to grow up, not our kids, for us to grow up, because we're still in the journey. As long as you stay in the journey of learning, that's going to be the best thing for your kids. So it's both a classroom and it's a crucible to introduce you as a father or as a mother to the heart of God. And so as you continue to do that, and as you kind of grab yourself around the heart of God, that's going to give you hope in the midst of the darkness, and it's going to teach you how to pray desperate prayers. So God introduced us to the blessing of desperation in the midst of our kids going crazy. And in our case anyway, even though we went through probably about 20 years of really some hard stuff, all three of our girls are absolutely the most delightful young ladies I know. Great fun. They love each other. We have a hoot. They've all rerouted themselves back in the Lord after they had walked away and rebelled. And so just some hope for you if you're going through it. Protect your marriage, have hope, pray like crazy, and keep the doors open for your kids in those times.
So Wendy, I'd love to hear you speak. Let's just pretend, obviously this never happened, but pretend one of your 6 daughters was in an unhealthy relationship or went through a time of rebellion. Any advice, any thoughts on how to walk through that?
Yeah, pray for the first, is the first thing. Pray for wisdom, like James says, God gives us wisdom generously, and pray for that. And then the one verse that I most love about Jesus is the one where it talks about him being full of grace and truth. And so I think to pray for wisdom to walk that grace truth line with the kids, like continue to show them I love you in every way you can while knowing when to hold out the truth as well and speak truth into their lives. And it's just, I feel like only God can give us that wisdom to know that balance. But yeah, we've been there, and we've prayed like desperation prayers, like, God, if you don't do something, we don't know what to do. But I think continuing to love them and communicate grace even as you speak truth.
So moving from like response and then negative to thinking proactively, one of my favorite quotes, old theologian Carl Rainer, is the Christian of the future will be a mystic, by which he just means someone who's personally experienced God. A mystic, someone who's experienced something deeply, or that of nothing. His point being that in our day and age, there's nothing cultural to carry you along. There's nothing else pushing you. Head knowledge is not enough. There's no reason to be a Christian unless you have personally met our Savior. So how do you, there's so much we can do, right? You can force them to read a Bible, you can force them to memorize things, or go to church, or pray, or do family devotionals, but you can't force someone to know and love Jesus. So how do you foster that? What type of experiences, what practical things have worked for you guys? And I'll just leave it open to anyone.
I think for our family, we run and live our lives in our home based on our relationship with Christ. And our kids see this day in and day out. And they see when we're struggling and we ask them to pray over us. And they see when we're sinning and we ask them to forgive us. And they see a fleshly example of what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus, as broken and sinful as we are. And I think that's one of the best testimonies. That's what all of the scriptures are. We get to see people walking with Christ. That's what influences our hearts to know and love God better. And I think we as a church culture and as a church family at GVF and in and of the world, like sharing our relationship with Christ with the people that we're around, not just Sundays from 8 to 10 a.m., but day in and day out, walking out our faith and letting people in and knowing what we're struggling with and what we need prayer for and what God is doing, testimonies of how God is blessing you and involved in your life. And for me, that's the best way I can lead my kids to Christ is through testimony and through example. It's also through prayer and scripture and all of the things like you said, but it's putting them around people whose lives have been changed. My stepdad was an alcoholic for 20 years and God has redeemed him, and it's sharing these testimonies again and again, and for them to see, God redeem things and God to heal and to expose them to people who aren't like us or how God has been working in their lives. So that's a gift you all can give my kids at GVF when you share your testimonies and your stories of your relationship with Christ with my kids. That's what helps them grow their faith, right?
Let me premise by saying I'm reminded of a U.S. Congressman, Willard Van Diver, who had come for a naval banquet to Philadelphia in 1899. And he said, frothy eloquence neither convinces nor satisfies me. I'm from Missouri. You've got to show me. And that's supposed to be the legend behind Missouri being called the Show Me State. And that, I think, is the model for parenting. The kids are, for all practical purposes, telling us, I'm watching you so closely I can't hear what you're saying. It's the show me model. So I think one of my greatest joys will be when I go home, that right from a little age, my kids, when I'm doing my quiet time, after reading my Bible, I kneel down to pray. And if they see me, they would come and get in the space between the bed and me and kneel down and ask for, essentially praying for them and blessing them. So even as I sound holy, I just want you to know I am aware that I'm the most wretched of all of us here. That is a great pleasure for me, to know that my kids would come and do that, and they take it from there. So it's the show me model. They have to first see it in us, and then we need to walk alongside them. So just over a year ago, the smartest kid in Nathaniel's class, so he was 16, and that's this particular girl. So they go to a classical Christian school, and she is an atheist. She had the most challenging questions, and he would bring those questions. He said, Appa, this particular girl has these questions. And I said, okay, bring the questions to me. So she wrote down the questions, and I responded to those questions. And then she responded back. Then I responded, went back and forth, and I said, bring her over. So we then brought her and her sister over. The first time we sat and talked for 4 hours. And he was really scared because he was like, she's going to tear me to bits because I don't know the answers. And I was like, yeah, I don't know all the answers, but I know someone who does. And so 2 weeks later, she and her sister came back again for another 3-hour session. It happened 3 times like that. So my point is, we have to show to them, and we have to walk alongside them, bring the wolves home so that we can have them tethered and addressed as much as we can. Not on our strength, for sure, but nevertheless, we have to do that.
Well, we're wrapping up on time, but I want to give Tom a chance to jump in.
One comment. It's not just the world out there that's going to disappoint your kids. It's going to be the Christian world as well. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to hit them. And so what is the reference point they're going to have for whether or not they want to be a Christian? And again, I bring back to the very, very, very simple thing. Get them, it's all about Jesus, and it sounds real simple, but if they can get captured by who he is, just in every level, that's going to, I think, do something. But also the show me thing. I didn't want to read this because it sounds like I'm really good. But I think hearing from a daughter, who's right over here, who was probably the one that took us the deepest into anguish and darkness and lostness and confusion, because she was intent on killing herself in one way or another. But anyway, she's a magnificent young lady right now. But she wrote this to me, just to remind you guys of the reference point that they're going to have all their lives, as long as you're alive, is this. She says, the single most impactful thing that you guys did as parents was to live out your faith faithfully and consistently, not perfectly. Watching you and Mom's passion for God and the joy you had in serving Him and in Him, despite the noise of the world and all that was going on, it made it real. It intrigued me even when I was lost, because I didn't understand it. But I knew then there had to be something in it, because you add joy and peace that didn't make sense in the world. You did many great things as parents, but the best thing you did was to stay spiritually healthy and to model what a relationship with the true God looks like. That was and still is the most important thing for me. Love you. So that's not to say that we were absolutely far, 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 far from perfect, but kids are looking, and you are the reference point that will be there for the rest of their lives, and break the pattern of a lot of the craziness that's out there in the name of Christ.
Sorry, the timer went off. All that to say, we are out of time, but now you know the experts to go to with all of your questions. And you know who to talk to if you want to homeschool or go to a private school or public school. With that, Tom, would you pray for us, and then I'll send us out.
Father, thank you that you take us on a journey. You are real. You are the real thing, and we want to become increasingly real and authentic, so that this world that has so many questions about Christianity can get a glimpse, not a perfect glimpse, but a glimpse of something that's real and authentic. And help us as moms and dads to just try to walk with you and journey with you and continue to grow in you, to nurture our own faith, to go through our own little crises of faith, but to bring them to you and push through them. So Lord, strengthen us, help us to raise up a generation of courageous, godly, joyful, fun, healthy, impactful generation. For the glory of Jesus, I pray. Amen.